Hello class, Associate Pastor Tyler here, and today we're doing a lesson on the New Testament survey, and I want to start off by talking about how we got the name New Testament. The first person to use the terms Old and New Testament was Tertullian, and he was one of the early church fathers. He was the first to use the terms Old and New when referring to the collections of documents we know as the Old and New Testament. The word testament comes from the Latin word testamentum, which was meant to translate the Greek word diatheke, which means covenant. This is fascinating when looking at it as it pertains to the Old and New Covenant. The Old Covenant was the covenant God made with Israel through Moses based on the law involving blessings for obedience, sacrifice for sins, and separation as God's chosen people. The Old Testament contains the writings associated with the Old Covenant, God's covenant with Israel under the law. The New Covenant is God's agreement established through Jesus Christ, based on grace, sealed by his blood, providing forgiveness of sins, a new heart, and a life in the Spirit for all who believe. So in light of that, the New Testament is a group of writings that testifies to God's new covenant relationship with his people through Jesus Christ. It's very important to remember the Old Testament ends with the expectation that one day God would establish a new covenant with his people. The New Testament is convinced that with the coming of Jesus Christ, the new covenant has already been established, and that's how we got the name New Testament. Next, I've made a slide arranging the books of the New Testament as they were written chronologically, but as you can tell from our canon today, the books weren't arranged chronologically, they were arranged logically. Matthew was not the first book to have been written, which is the first book in the New Testament. The New Testament starts with the four Gospels because they provide a natural bridge between the Old and New Testament. More importantly, they relay the life and ministry of the founder of Christianity, Jesus Christ, who brings to fulfillment all of the expectations and promises of the Old Testament. Because of those two reasons, logically, the Gospels are arranged first, even though they were written later. Acts comes next because it explains how Christianity spread beyond Jerusalem and Judea into the larger speaking Greek world. Acts also introduces us some very important characters like Paul, who writes the next 13 letters. Next in the arrangement are the 13 letters that Paul wrote, and they help us understand the Gospels and Acts. All are written in context of what we see from Acts 1 through 28. After Paul's letters come what we know as the general letters and are written by leaders in the church who were introduced in the book of Acts. Then finally, the book of Revelation ends the arrangement. And logically it fits because it relates the climax of God's redemptive plan of saving the universe. So it's a fitting end to the arrangement. The next thing we're going to talk about are the three literary genres seen in the New Testament. And the first is narrative. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even Acts, being a little different from the four Gospels, are considered narrative literature. And narrative literature in the first century looked a lot different than it does today. These books are actually considered first century Greco-Roman biographies or historiographies, and they weren't so concerned with word-for-word accounts or play-by-play descriptions. Rather, they recorded key moments and were far more selective theologically speaking. Each book conveys a different theological point, and the authors are selective in what they put in the book in order to communicate that. The second genre is epistolary, or better known today as a letter. We're familiar with what a letter is. However, in the first century, they were structured in such a way that we today don't recognize or even notice. Letters in the first century were used to convey any kind of information and would follow a certain format. It's important to remember that the letters were considered as official of a document as they went back then, and officially took the place of the author. And the letters tended to be very clear, direct, and informative. The last literary type we see in the New Testament is apocalypse. Revelation is the only one of its kind in the New Testament canon. Understanding what kind of literary genre Revelation is crucial to how we understand the contents of the book and to not abuse it. Apocalypse is a common literary form of the first century and before that. The book of Daniel is actually considered a part of the apocalypse genre. And the apocalypse genre is basically this. It's a first-person autobiographical account of a visionary experience, usually communicated in highly symbolic language using strange beasts and images, which all of that stuff meant something to first century readers, but it doesn't necessarily mean something to us today. The last thing we're going to talk about is how we actually got the New Testament canon. And there was actually some criteria that had to be met. The criteria would be that the book must have been written by an apostle or someone with a direct link to an apostle. The book must be widely accepted by the majority of the church and used in worship and teaching. And the book must conform to apostolic teachings and harmonizes with the rest of Scripture. and it must be divinely inspired. The books of the New Testament canon were finally ratified by the Council of Hippos and the Council of Carthage. But if you look at the dates, it's several hundred years after the last book was written in the New Testament, which was Revelation at about 95 AD. And because it's just not that simple. Revelation wasn't written, and then the next day the New Testament canon was given to us. The New Testament canon is not attributed to a single person or thing. It's way more organic than that. God, through his divine sovereignty, organized it through the men and women of the first century that would be formed a few centuries later, a body of material that 2 Timothy 3:16 through 17 says is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. These books have divine authority. These are the 27 books that God established over hundreds of years through his church, for his church. Some people have criticized the process of canonization and say the church created the New Testament. Class, the church did not create the New Testament. The New Testament created the church.